Ohayo gozaimasu and bonjour and welcome to a departure of a video. I'm not going to link this in any way to my Naruse retrospective, in no way whatsoever. But I am going to suggest that my work on Naruse Mikio, on looking at his career through reviews of individual films, is one way of looking at a director's career, is one way of assessing the worth of a filmmaker, but it is by no means the only way. You will have noticed in a lot of my videos that I have suggested points of contrast and comparison with other films, filmmakers, what have you, as a way of adumbrating where a particular director or film stands in a wider context. I think this is important. No films are ever made in a vacuum, in any kind of vacuum. And often there are all kinds of factors that impact on and influence how a film turns out. And I think it's important to consider all of these. Films are realised at the confluence of a lot of these different factors, be they cultural, social, political, personal, or what have you. And that led me, in considering this approach, to a comparison of two films made only 2 years apart by two very significant, important, perceived auteur directors, adapting the same source material in very, very different ways. These are Kurosawa Akira on the one hand, and on the other, the sometimes referred to enfant terrible of French cinema, one of the key figures of the new wave, and latterly sort of film and video essayist Jean-Luc Godard. And the source material in question is none other than Shakespeare's King Lear. For Kurosawa, this adaptation, this source material, was not a huge surprise, if only because he was very fond of Shakespeare. He was very widely read and had already adapted Shakespeare in various ways in several earlier films. He adapted Macbeth into Throne of Blood at the end of the 1950s. But he also drew on, if not quite adapted, Hamlet into his sort of contemporary corporate thriller, The Bad Sleep Well. So he was well versed in Shakespeare. We might also think of the film he had made prior to Ran, the film that I'm looking at today, or one of the films I'm looking at today, in 1980, the film Kagemusha, which, although it doesn't adapt Shakespeare, certainly has a lot of consonance with the history plays of this director. And he moved on from this sort of echo of Shakespeare's history plays to a direct adaptation of one of his key tragedies with his next film, and in what many consider to be the sort of crowning glory of his career. Godard, on the other hand, although he often drew on a whole plethora of different source materials, didn't often adapt single texts, and certainly very seldomly, and even more seldomly overtly, drew on Shakespeare. So we have an adaptation of King Lear on the one hand, by a director very much given to consulting Shakespeare, reading Shakespeare and adapting Shakespeare, and a director on the other who had almost no real provenance in adapting this particular author and his work. So we have two very contrastive case studies, and unsurprisingly, the films that resulted are extremely different. Couldn't be more different, in fact. And I think that this sense of difference, of having two almost radically contrastive works, says a lot about what Shakespeare means to each of these directors, perhaps at respectively different but advanced stages of their careers, and what this particular text, King Lear, means to each of these directors. We hadn't seen this kind of revision of Shakespeare, I think, cinematically prior to the 1980s. Kurosawa's Ran was 1985, Godard's King Lear 87. There had, of course, been a lot of adaptations of Shakespeare. There had been several key screen adaptations of King Lear, one made in England by Peter Brook, the notable theatre director Peter Brook, and around the same time a version by the Russian director Grigory Kozintsev. And both of these films, I'm not going to use the word faithful because I hate that word as regards adaptation, and it should be banned from the lexicon, the vocabulary, when discussing adaptation. But both these works, which were made in the same year and actually saw the directors conversing with each other, retain quite a lot of the plot, the themes and the characters of Shakespeare's original play, and some of the issues that go along with that. Kozintsev's is a strange film. It retains so much of the plot, yet visualizes it in such a way that almost defamiliarizes the play. It seems like almost as though the director wants us to scrutinize the plot. It's almost meta Shakespeare. It's visualized in stark black and white in a landscape that looks very little like England, with actors all speaking Russian, even though it retains character names and is set in England. So that's a strange film. But Kurosawa and Godard take this a step further, at least to the extent that they depart from the paper, if you like, of Shakespeare, the text, the language, the narrative, and some of the supporting characters. They certainly, Kurosawa retains some in a different guise. Godard dismisses quite a lot, and indeed frames what he does retain in a plot with other competing story elements that, not a million miles away from Kozintsev, seems designed to foster or facilitate an observational and a almost contemplative sort of stance or perspective on the part of his audience, to get us to scrutinize, in this case, I think, not just Shakespeare, but what Godard is doing with it. So it's meta cinematic as well as arguably meta Shakespearean. very much unlike Bruck and Kozintsev, the actual dialogue and prose of Shakespeare's play is entirely discarded by both Kurosawa and by Godard, and there's no real attempt, despite what some critics and commentators have noted. I don't think there's any real overt attempt to find a visual sort of equivalent or correlative to Shakespeare's language. I think there is, as a very well mounted, at times visually arresting historical epic, there is a grandeur to Kurosawa's vision and cinematic eye, but I can't see, and I've seen this film more times than I care to remember, I've never been able to see where there is a specific sense of trying to directly visualize what Shakespeare describes, or how the characters talk, the dialogues, the soliloquies. I think there is a reasonable gulf, and the mise en scène and cinematography of Ran, I think, owe much more to Kurosawa than they do to Shakespeare. And similarly with Godard, I mean, several of his works around this time are set largely in hotels. Films like Prénom Carmen and Detective, as well as others. And so it is in his King Lear here, that largely there is a central space of a hotel, and elsewhere the exterior scenes owe, again, almost nothing, if not nothing at all, to Shakespeare. There's no real attempt to transpose the language, the dialogue, the descriptions offered in the play to the cinema at all. So, with all this being said, what do Kurosawa and Godard retain, and what do they do with the text? What does the original Shakespearean play become in their very capable, very singular cinematic hands? Well, I don't want to say that Kurosawa set out consciously or overtly to tighten up, as it were, Shakespeare's plot. I think many commentators of the play have noticed and analysed the extent to which there is a lack of a unity in the original play in terms of the narrative. That it just seems like largely a progression of scenes rather than a cogently developed narrative. I think there is the illusion of such a narrative, but it relies a hell of a lot on chance, coincidence, and sort of random encounters that the plot requires, but which, given a moment's scrutiny, don't really hold up. This is something that Bruck and Kozintsev arguably retain in keeping the main plot and the subplots, the central and supporting characters, entirely intact from Shakespeare's play. And in the case of Ran, whilst Kurosawa does not entirely sort of overwrite or override this aspect of the original play, the changes that he makes to some of the characters make this slightly less of a problem, I think. What Kurosawa and his screenwriters do in Ran is to tie together more strongly the main plot of the narrative with the subplot or subplots that here dovetail much more dramatically and to a certain extent more organically with said main plot. So from this point of view, there is a much more unified, if that's the right term, sense of narrative cohesion and by extension of the diegetic world. There is also a strong sense that the figure of Lear comes more dramatically into focus here. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. First, I think it would be beneficial to just offer a brief outline of Shakespeare's King Lear as a point of departure for discussing the respective adaptations offered by Kurosawa and by Godard. So, King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, starts with the figure of the title in a foolish fondness for his children, deciding to divide up his kingdom amongst his three daughters. He is advised against this, but he declares that each girl's statement of love for him should determine the portion of his kingdom that she receives as her dowry. The oldest daughter, Goneril, she's the Duchess of Albany, is the first to speak, and she says that she loves her father more than eyesight, space, liberty, or even of life itself. Regan, the middle daughter, the Duchess of Cornwall, announces that the sentiment of her love has already been expressed by Goneril, but that Goneril had stopped short of declaring how powerful was Regan's love. The youngest daughter, Cordelia, speaks that her love is far more overt and far deeper than she has the ability to communicate, and she tells her father that her love is in her heart and not in her mouth, and she's unwilling to sacrifice anything in terms of eloquence, spoken eloquence, for the truth of her feelings. This the king misperceives as disrespect and a lack of love, and she is in effect decried her dowry, and a portion of the kingdom is ordered to be divided between her elder sisters, between Goneril and Regan. The arguable lack of mental acuity that the title character shows in this decision begins to deteriorate even more as he takes a retainer of guards and aides, including his fool, and proceeds to visit first his eldest daughter, and when she chastises him, his second daughter. She also chastises him, and Lear rather abruptly storms out from her abode as well. And begins to lose any real sort of grip on reality as he bemoans and angrily sort of states that his eldest daughters have betrayed him. But he feels, as he begins to recognize the truth and the real love of his youngest, of Cordelia, that he can't really go to her. In the play, she is not any longer around anyway. So he's left to wander as an outcast, and he comes across various characters as he does so. Developing alongside this story is that of the Earl of Gloucester and his two sons, the illegitimate Edmund and his actual son, Edgar. Edmund fears that his illegitimacy will cost him any real right to a portion of the Earl of Gloucester's land and title, and he conspires to frame his half-brother, who takes his leave from the kingdom of the Earl because of the manipulations and schemings of Edmund. Edgar then, like the king, is an outcast. He pretends to be a madman in order to find his way back to take some measure of revenge. And whilst both are in flight from their respective lives and kingdoms, they meet each other. Trouble ensues in the form of a developing tension between the two sisters when they vie, essentially, for the affections of Edmund, who has further conspired against his father, who is punished by having his eyes gouged out, and he is then sort of cast out and comes across comes across Edgar while he is still pretending to be a madman. And together, the once Earl of Gloucester, Edgar, his true son and heir, Lear and the fool, make their way. Cordelia, who has married an earlier suitor, learns of her father's predicament and makes her way with her husband and their camp in order to meet her father, and they have a reunion, and Lear is able, if only in part, to offer something like an apology and to recognise his daughter and recognise the wrongs of his earlier decisions and actions. They are actually taken prisoner, though, by forces commanded by Edmund, and when they are brought back to his encampment, things reach a tragic and quite bleak conclusion that sees almost all of the main characters dying in one way or another, and the future left very uncertain. Now, as noted, Kurosawa transposes King Lear to feudal Japan. He retains the figure of Lear. Here he is a warlord, but the three daughters in Shakespeare become three sons here. The dividing up of the kingdom and the rejection of the youngest child because of a perceived lack of due filial piety are retained. However, the subplots that bolster and adumbrate this main plot are changed so that the agency and something of the life and history of the Lear figure, here called Hidetora, is communicated, where in Shakespeare and in many adaptations, there's very little sense of the life of the characters or of the sort of wider context of the nation outside of the immediate confines of the narrative. One can't really get much of a grip on or understand much about the characters prior to the beginning of the narrative, and the bleak ending in which most of the characters die suggests little about how the world of the film, the England of the narrative, will develop. In Ran, there is a keenly felt and reasonably detailed, if only through inference and exposition, history to Hidetora, the Lear figure, and by extension, the history of this particular period in Japanese history, when in the 15th and 16th centuries, when regional daimyo or warlords, feudal lords, were vying for control of large swathes of the country and were attempting to gain national control, to unify all the warring states and unify Japan, to bring Japan under a single shogunate, which would eventually happen at the very beginning of the 17th century. This is also the background that Kurosawa dramatizes and depicts in Kagemusha, a film made 5 years earlier. So in a sense, these are companion pieces, and also, given that I've already alluded to Kagemusha as somewhat akin to a Shakespeare history play, the fact that Kurosawa turns to a Shakespearean tragedy here also lends credence to the fact that these two films are in fact companion pieces. So here in Ran, in terms of how Hidetora develops, there is a consonance with Lear, with the Shakespearean protagonist. He divides up his kingdom based on hearing from his sons what he wants to hear, at least from his eldest two sons, disinherits his youngest, here named Saburo, casts him out. Quickly thereafter finds, when he visits his two sons, that their filial piety was just for show, and then finds himself cast adrift and suffering a kind of mental, emotional fatigue and degradation, until ultimately there is a very brief reunion with Saburo, as the two oldest sons wage war, and a final battle leads to the same deaths, the same sense of bleakness that Shakespeare dramatizes. However, the subplots feed into this a little bit more deeply, in more detail here. So the subsidiary characters of the Earl of Gloucester and of Edgar are in effect fused together. So we have the presence of a young character who the king runs across when he is caught in a storm, which is perhaps one of the only times here where Kurosawa, shooting in a real typhoon, incidentally, dramatizes and visualizes a moment in the plot where there is a manifest sort of visual symbolism, the storm kind of representing the chaotic emotional travails and turbulence undergone by Hidetora. And this young character, young like Edgar, has also been blinded. And this is something that the Hidetora, the King Lear character, is responsible for. This is because of an attack he foisted upon the castle in which this young character was living. He also then, in essence, imprisoned his sister, Sue. So the blindness of the Earl of Gloucester, which is meted out as a punishment for perceived sympathies towards King Lear in the Shakespeare play, is here something that becomes even more of a mark of the sort of past wrongdoings, the past sort of evil incarnation of what Hidetora used to be as a sort of bloodthirsty warlord, a battle-hungry warlord. So there is much more of a connection between these two characters, much more of a sense in which main plot and subplot, main character and secondary character sort of relate to one another. And in this, the blindness that is a mere sort of narrative trope of the character in Shakespeare, the Earl of Gloucester, here takes on a kind of a symbolic resonance, as we can see him as a manifestation of the figurative blindness of the Hidetora of years gone by, the fact that he was blind to the sufferings of others, and indeed in the more recent present, as depicted in the film, he has been blind to the real feelings of the sons, the fact that he has been blind to the real love of the youngest and was taken in by the proclamations of love and filial piety by the two oldest. Kurosawa, like Shakespeare, ends his narrative with an image of this character where Edgar is, in a sense, left to rebuild a shattered and divided country in terms of England at the end of Shakespeare's play. This sort of transposition of Edgar is the character with whom Kurosawa chooses to close Ran. We see this blind character perched high atop a derelict castle wall, clutching and finally dropping a Buddhist scroll that his sister, who had been briefly reunited with him, had given him as a means of hope and succor. So we see this character perched precipitously high on a ledge, losing the one means of quasi comfort that he has, But the fact that this character is in no way the fighter, the warrior that Edgar is, and indeed is blind like Gloucester, it's not Edgar who is blind, suggests an even bleaker sense that the country is divided, that that there really is no hope for the future, not even from any belief in a Buddhist deity or perhaps any other. So there really is no hope. There's nothing materialistic to cling to, and there's nothing lofty, there's nothing spiritual to cling to. Kurosawa actually spoke of his vision of Ran, the way that he shot and edited the film, as to be a means of replicating the point of view of a deity in tears. So a god-like figure, be it Buddha or whoever, looking down on the affairs of the human realm and weeping as to their selfish, materialistic, greedy actions, the way that they betray and manipulate each other, and the way that they inevitably, inexorably sort of ruin their own lives. And I think here, for anyone with a knowledge of Japanese history, the sense that there really is no hope for the future rhymes, or perhaps sort of discordantly clashes with the notion that Japan was unified, was placed on a better path at the beginning of the 17th century with the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, when the warlord Tokugawa Ieyasu, who is a character in Kagemusha, finally managed to defeat his opponents and to unify Japan. But the suggestion here is that this ultimately perhaps was not for the good, for the benefit of Japan. Perhaps, and this is pure speculation, but given that this unification entailed Japan closing its borders to all but a very select few, a state of insular isolation that would remain in place for 2.5 centuries, is suggestive of potential harm done to the country, because when Japan was opened up to trade and opened up to the rest of the world, beginning in the middle 19th century and ultimately developing into what is known as the Meiji Restoration from 1867 onwards, this entailed numerous problems, particularly as this marked the end of the samurai as a kind of social caste in the country. And there were all kinds of issues with Japan sort of modernizing, westernizing, and having to adapt itself to being part of the wider world, something it also had to do after World War II. So ultimately, this sense of a kind of dour look at what would happen to Japan, the direction the country would go in centuries hence, is kind of interestingly embedded in the ending of Ran. There is, I think, an alternative reading here, which relates to seeing Ran and Kagemusha as companion pieces. The fact that Kagemusha is built around actual historical figures and details a very specific period in Japanese history, clashes with or is mirrored by Rand's, in effect, concern with completely fictional characters during a time when we can certainly speculate, as I have done, about when it is, but it is in effect, arguably, at least, ahistorical in not having the kind of specificity that Kagemusha has. And I think a lot of the visual style of the film stresses this. The film is replete with shots of landscape, both empty and peopled with warriors, that has no real charge in terms of being recognizably Japanese. The film, in fact, opens with characters mounted statically on horseback, looking out over rolling hills. And thereafter, there are sweeping plains, there are castles, but none of which are actual castles, unlike in Kagemusha, where famous historical landmarks such as Himeji Castle are employed by Kurosawa. Here, there is a vision of abstractness. There is a blank quality, almost like a tabula rasa, as though something is being written and created here rather than recreated as Kurosawa was doing in his previous film. I think the point of using an established text, a transnational text, as Kurosawa had done before, here is to stress this sense of not being concerned specifically with Japan per se, with Japanese history or culture or national identity, if we can talk about such a tenuous thing per se. It's about creating something that's a hybrid, creating something that's almost like a bricolage that suggests a post-modernity. And indeed, I think there is a postmodern kind of carnivalesque aspect to King Lear, the text, Shakespeare's King Lear, where we have the high and mighty brought low, and the prevalence of the fool that that Kurosawa interestingly retains. He even adumbrates and beefs up the role of the fool here, who is constantly berating Hidetora, who's constantly spouting sort of pseudo-philosophical epithets. And indeed, he's played by a transvestite, a famous transvestite performer called Pita. This emphasizes this sense of the world, the order of the world being completely reversed and destabilized. So there is a kind of commentary on Shakespeare here, and a sense of it being especially applicable in and appropriate to a time where perhaps extant notions of national identity, of stability, of perhaps belief in a higher power are being completely eroded. Perhaps we can relate this to the sense of the materialistic sort of capitalist development of Japan, but I think it goes beyond that and speaks subtly to a kind of globalized world wherein notions of cultural refinement, of cultural hierarchy, have been eroded, if not completely sort of negated and obliterated. So there is a lot to unpack and read into Kurosawa's Ran. And I think he, having dipped his toes in the water of adapting Shakespeare before, really uses that intertextual lineage, films like Throne of Blood and The Bad Sleep Well, and not quite to the same degree Kagemusha, in order to stress that he's using Shakespeare here in a different way and to, I think, markedly different ends. So, what to make in comparison with this of Jean-Luc Godard's King Lear? This is a film that, on the surface at least, has very little, if any, resemblance to Shakespeare's play. It is a present day film, a film with numerous plot lines that do not exist in a main and subsidiary relationship. There is little sense of a main dramatic through line and subplot or subplots that adumbrate this or feed into this. The film, as I mentioned, is set largely inside of a hotel. Within the confines of this hotel is a apparent descendant of William Shakespeare, whose job, it emerges and develops, is to unearth and sort of reacquaint both himself and the world with Shakespeare in particular and with the culture of the world in general, because in the diegesis here, in the narrative world, post Chernobyl, as we're told, post sort of nuclear disaster, all culture has been effaced. It's been wiped from the face of the earth. So this descendant of Shakespeare, also called Shakespeare, is tasked with finding his descendants' texts and with restoring culture, specifically high culture, to the world. Against this is a father and daughter, Don Learo and Cordelia, who are staying at the same hotel in Switzerland. The film was largely shot in Switzerland, Godard's native land. And this Don Learo is in the process of dictating a kind of novel, kind of memoir that is loosely based on King Lear. This is something that in its early stages informed this project, that a kind of adaptation of King Lear based around the text being transposed into being a kind of gangster film. Meanwhile, the research into his descendants' texts, his search, therefore, leads William Shakespeare to meet a reclusive genius, played by Godard himself, called Pluggy, whose own odd, shall I say, and that's an understatement, research is leading him into all kinds of theoretical and practical experiments that may or may not have some bearing on Shakespeare's text and the search for this by the protagonist. So what can we say about Godard's King Lear? Its relationship to Shakespeare, its place in Godard's filmography, and its general efficacy with regard to adaptations on screen. I think typically for Godard, this is highly self-reflexive. It is about its own project, its own process of creation, its own process of adaptation. It's also about its own struggles, the practical difficulties that Godard encountered in getting this film made. It begins with two very short scenes featuring the author Norman Mailer and his daughter. These were filmed early in production when Mailer had been cast as Don Learo and his daughter as Cordelia. Mailer seems to be reading correspondence from Godard and others, producers, studio personnel, other financiers, and then disappears from the film. And indeed, it was the case that Mailer was cast, his daughter was cast, and tensions ensued, and both very shortly into production left the film. And Godard incorporates this into the narrative. Again, this is very typical. A lot of Godard's films around this time are about themselves, about their own systems of communication, about their own meaning-making signs and systems, and about how we sort of react to and engage with them. So they're very open-ended from this point of view. The notion of a sort of almost post-apocalyptic world where culture has disappeared and needs reviving, needs refinding, is an interesting one. And from this point of view, Godard's own presence in the film is quite telling. On screen, Godard seems to be distinct from the search for culture, the search for Shakespeare, the search for King Lear. But of course, behind the camera, he is the instigator and the orchestrator. He is searching for King Lear as much as the protagonist is. He's searching for a viable way to realize King Lear and a means of suggesting something, I think, about the relevance and resonance of King Lear in a contemporary age, an age where culture has been wiped out. And I think we have to take that as a sort of veiled comment on the state of cinema in particular. He'd ended his earlier film Weekend at the end of the 60s with a gnomic pronouncement of the end of cinema. And I think he is working in a post-cinematic age here, a post-cultural age, and trying to find something amidst the detritus, amidst the ashes of culture. So there's a tension there between these different Godards. There's also a tension between Godard playing, in essence, the king, the high and mighty figure, the ruler, the controller of all that he surveys, which Godard as director, we could say, is. With Godard as playing the fool, although actually the film in some of its promotion stressed the presence of Woody Allen as the fool, this is a little bit of a red herring. Allen appears towards the end of the film and is there only in a almost non-diegetic way. I think it's almost like an audition. He's reading a prepared text with little feeling and bears almost no relation to The Fall other than the persona of Woody Allen and what this conjures up for audiences. The real fall throughout, I think, is Godard's inventor, the person who is seen in a variety of different physical guises, whose voiceover peppers the narrative with a series of kind of, again, philosophical pronouncements, something that links his fall to Kurosawa's Fall, played by Peter in Ran. So again, we have this tension, this sense of two different faces of Godard, and a sort of dichotomy that opens up between them. And I think in amongst these opposing poles lies a liminal space where the meaning of this film can be pronounced and realised. I think it relates more than anything else, and this perhaps connects Godard's film, however improbably, with Kurosawa's Ran, to a sense of defining and exploring a world from which any certainties, any stability have and has been leached, has been sort of undermined, if not taken away. So even the hitherto sort of firmly held sureties of something like Shakespeare, of a pronounced cultural lineage and national heritage, is absent here, has been problematized, if not obliterated. And Godard is trying to explore what culture means in this world, why we should seek it out, why it should be lionized or canonized. And he is intent to probe his own place in this cultural canonization, where he stands in relation to a figure like Shakespeare. And this is why there are all kinds of cinematic images and references here. I won't go into them and ruin it, because I think there is an element of surprise in some of these. It kind of looks forward to Godard's later sort of compendium of cinema, Histoire du Cinéma, his three-part sort of exploration of the history of cinema, a very personal, typically essayistic undertaking. So there's a lot that relates to how, perhaps even why, we should engage with Shakespeare, and the eclectic cast, which features, as well as Woody Allen, Burgess Meredith, and Molly Ringwald. Remember her from the Brat Pack movies of the 1980s, as Don Liaro and Cordelia, kind of defining for themselves as both characters and actors in a way how they can personally, relate to these roles, what these roles mean for them, in terms of the careers of the actors as much as the sort of dramatic or emotional trajectories of their characters. As to the specific point of using King Lear as the focal adaptation, I'm not sure there's a great deal in that. Other critics, notably Richard Brody, have argued that rhymes with Godard's work at this period in his career, when he was showing some predilection for exploring relationships between fathers and daughters. For me, this is a little bit tenuous, and I'm not sure that there is ultimately anything in Shakespeare that actually puts much meat on the bones of a specific father-daughter relationship. One of the issues I've had, I think, with the play, and I think this is not present in Kurosawa's transposition, is the fact of, okay, there is an exploration of parental anxiety here, but I think if you are talking about dividing up a kingdom, if you're going to forego the obvious point of patriarchal succession here, then you really need to do a little bit more with it. There is all kinds of sort of infighting and backbiting by the men in Goneril and Regan's lives in particular. But I think the fundamentals of the familial and parental drama don't really bespeak much in the way of a specifically father-daughter relationship, where Kurosawa's Ran really does question and probe notions of, as I said, patrilineal succession, the notion of how men in power, in positions of power, behave, and the fact that he makes such a meaty role of one of the older brother's wives, who it turns out is trying to usurp the whole sort of family, if you like, and destroy Hidetora's family as revenge for him sort of ransacking the castle that she grew up in and slaughtering her parents. Actually highlights questions of gender and of male and female sort of roles and responsibilities within families. And I think, dare I say, Kurosawa does this more thoughtfully, with a little bit more depth than Shakespeare. And Godard really adds little to this. Lear feels very much like a point of departure here. It feels very much like it could have been really any Shakespeare play. Perhaps this is an arguable point. I'm sure there will be dissenting views. Please do comment below and let me know if and to what extent you disagree with me. But it feels like it could have been any Shakespearean text here. Or indeed it could have been any text of sort of perceived canonical heritage and standing. It feels a little bit perhaps cynical on Godard's part, although, as I said, the way that he fleshes out the character of the fool and explores his own kind of fractious position vis-a-vis culture and cinema and Shakespeare suggests that, to a certain extent at least, this tenuous relationship with King Lear may actually be the very point, or at least one of the points of the picture. But ultimately, I think there is such a typical sort of wealth, almost onslaught of intellectual material here, that Godard's at times stated aim to let images speak for themselves, feels a little bit rich and redundant. I think there is little in here that doesn't need kind of unpacking and decoding. There's a very, as again Richard Brody has pointed out, a very dense and a very layered soundtrack, and a lot of images that have all kinds of intertextual reference. And again, you know, there are points that can be raised about the fabric of culture, if you like, the relationship of cultural producers to cultural consumers. And in that, I think there's a lot to be said, or quite a bit to be said, for our own relationship to the text. The film, I think, is open enough to imbricate its audience in the process of making meaning, and to suggest slyly that we may be either kings or fools in the way that we consume, the way that we read cultural material, and the way that we assign it labels based on name or based on history or tradition or what have you. So it's far from a worthless or redundant film, I think. It is, if anyone else knows other Godard films from this period, if you've seen Sauf qui peut, if you've seen the later Forever Mozart, the tonality of this film, the kind of wintry, mournful, haunting tone that permeates the film will be familiar to you. And I think that is a reward in its own right. There is a kind of directness to this. It's a film that kind of works on the emotions subtly and surreptitiously without you quite being aware of what it is that's moving you. And this is part of why I'm suggesting that it's about our own feelings and perceptions vis-a-vis, you know, Godard, Shakespeare, what have you. And ultimately, you know, any conclusions are entirely our own and not there from Godard. And I think, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, that's how it should be. So, with all that said, I would definitely recommend these two films. I may as well state that I prefer Ran to Godard's King Lear. That's not to do with my predilections for Japanese culture and Japanese cinema, but hopefully I can get you to watch these films and provoke debate, provoke argument and disagreement without hopefully anyone being disagreeable. So please do watch these. Let me know what you think. As I said before, comment below. Tell me which you prefer. Tell me about other Shakespeare takes or adaptations that you are familiar with. And I know this has been a long video, so thank you very, very much for watching. Follow me on X at AdamBingham01. Look out for my website, culturaljapan.com. And I look forward to speaking to you all the next time.